Thanks to everybody that's hung around this long. I know doing conferences all day can be a lot, going from speaker to speaker. Let me swap this up. All right. So as was mentioned before, we're going to be talking about adversary emulation and automating adaptive adversaries. A little bit about who I am. I'm the adversary emulation lead at Scythe. Now that's only been my role for the past year or so. Prior to that, I worked at Sandia National Labs. I was on the information design assurance red team there for a number of years, probably about 5 years total. And I also worked at MITRE on the MITRE attack team, worked on Caldera and the attack evaluations. So if you know me and you know some of my talks, attack is going to pop up. So just warning you in advance. Now, our word of the day is scale. And when it comes to talking about adversaries, especially adaptive adversaries, they're looking at having bigger impacts. So automating their actions, those types of things, that's really what they're trying to do day to day. And ultimately what I'm looking to give you all in this talk is not only just sort of a view in how you can do it, but also just how to think about it and give you some examples and sort of a modular framework to work through so that you can pick an adversary that you care about. Now, everyone's going to have different adversaries that target their either industry or that you might be worried about. So that's something that you can sub in whatever adversary you want as we walk through these examples. And the idea behind this is that this is something that you can hopefully take to your day-to-day job and use, as well as something that you can sort of follow along with here. So automation really allows consistency at scale. This is something that's really important, sort of a simple concept, but overall is why we want to automate things. Getting a bunch of experts together in a room is something that's great, but trying to get them to hack everybody on the planet, if you're a nation state, is something that's much more difficult to do. You need tools, you need ways to scale that expertise. And so that's where when we're talking about adaptability, it's really capability. What can they do consistently? What are they able to build? And what is the objectives they're able to consistently basically fulfill for whatever their mission is? Now that's why I sort of like to sub this here is we're actually not automating the adaptive adversaries. What does that mean? It's mostly the capability, their own development, how they do research and how they transition that research into something that's scalable. Now, with something when it comes to red teamers, pen testers, things like that, is that it's easy to think of yourself as adaptable because you can get past anything if you're given enough time, money. You've got something like Kali Linux, and that's sort of how you gear up. Now, this is not how adversaries gear up. They don't get a special version of Kali Linux necessarily. They have a couple different tools. And that's where we talk about scale. Individual people with Kali Linux, frankly, does not scale. That's not something that by itself works at scaling up to nation state levels. And so that's really the main message here when we're talking about scale is that individual expertise, it doesn't scale. It's not something that it's good for trying things out. It's good for learning lessons and maybe for business impact and the types of tests that you're trying to do, that can work. But when we're talking about adversaries that are constantly adapting to a changing defensive environment that have to target different organizations, they can't afford to have new people every time try and relearn something. And so that's why we want to talk about what are some of these tools, what are some of these ways adversaries do it. Now, this is how adversaries gear up. So if you're familiar with the screenshot on the left side here, this is Cobalt Strike. And lots of adversaries, especially ransomware threat actors, have been using cracked versions of Cobalt Strike. And like we have seen I think it was about a year ago now, somebody didn't get paid in the ransomware world, and as such, they leaked out a playbook. And so this is the Conti ransomware that was leaked, and of course it was in Russian, and then it was translated, and so what you're looking at is the translation there on the right. Now, this is better documentation than any offensive security tool or playbook, runbook, whatever you want to call it, that I've ever seen, or anyone really had seen. And the idea behind this is that the operators, the people that are going to be using this, can copy and paste. That is the only skill they need to know. They can copy and paste everything. In fact, they do it so well that if someone did a typo in the runbook, they will copy paste that too, and it won't work. But that's the level that they are trying to go to. They are looking for scale. They want anybody, they want to give them a Cobalt Strike terminal and say, just copy and paste these commands. That's all it takes. And so that is scalable, because if you can get anybody that can copy and paste, that's a much easier skill to teach than somebody that needs to be a red team or penetration testing expert. So how do we measure this capability and how adversaries are looking at it? The overall concept of this comes from something called Wardley maps. Simon Wardley does value chain mapping, and the idea behind this was that it was something for looking at how to map businesses in competition. And it really breaks down to three, I sort of took it, butchered it a little bit, and broke it down into sort of InfoSec terms, and I've broken it down into three major bins when you're measuring capability. The first thing is research. Everything starts as an idea. You've heard lots of talks here that talk about some of the different research ideas as people are sort of pushing the boundaries of their field. And this is where things are unproven. A theoretical attack may or may not work. And in this example I'm going to give before diving into sort of the cybersecurity example is wishing to fasten two things together. Now, the next thing after we have research is we have custom. This is where you have your proof of concept, something that is custom built, that takes an expert to operate it, and it may not even work every time. And so this is where if you have fasteners, want to fasten two things together, and same with like nuts and bolts. Used to be that artisans made these nuts and bolts individually. Only one worked with the only artisan that built it was the only one that knew exactly how to carve it out correctly. And that's great, but it, again, doesn't scale, because when you need to build a ship or you need to build, these days, anything from IKEA, for instance, you need a lot of these. And so that's where the product part comes in, is that this is really a maturation of any sort of capability. You started as research, but as you're trying to scale it, you're really trying to get to product. And so that's what we're going to do for talking about cybersecurity capabilities. Now, of course, let's dive in and look at reframing this challenge with our new three bins that we talked about. And this is where I warned you before, MITRE ATT&CK's coming in, because this is a way, it's an open source framework, it's a really good way of charting how real adversaries are performing their actions. Now, if you're unfamiliar about how MITRE ATT&CK works, or you've heard about it but don't use it, it has basically three layers of sort of abstractions. The broadest one is tactics at the bottom, and this is going to be the objectives adversaries are trying to achieve. It's sort of the 10,000-foot view. It's things like initial access, resources, that kind of thing. Now, under each of those tactics, you have specific techniques. And this is where we start to dive a little bit deeper into each of these things. Techniques are going to be the technical means by which adversaries achieve those goals. And then we have our procedures, which are our most granular. This is going to be the exact things that the adversary ran on a system, for instance, in order to achieve their goal. So let's look at starting from the broadest, drilling down deep. And this is where credential access is an example of a tactic. It has this little T number, TA, and then T is for technique, and then procedures really don't have a mapping. So that's where we'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges of that a little bit later. But when we're talking about mapping your different tactics across these, this is where you can either map your team, you can map the tools you're using, you can map a specific adversary. Now, defense evasion is something that tends to be something that is sort of cutting edge, but a lot of adversaries and red teamers, they all have this as custom, right? They all have to build this each and every time. Give credit to the EDR vendors. They do a pretty good job, or at least spend a lot of money on people that do good jobs on building out really good signatures based on specific tools. For instance, Mimikatz, it would be one of those. But defense evasion, to make sure those things run, tends to be something that you have to do over and over again and continually do. So that is custom. Now, discovery. This is something looking at assets on a network, adversaries trying to discover things for lateral movement, things like that. This is something that does tend to be more of a product. Nmap, for instance. And so this is how you would begin to map out the different tactics that you're concerned about, either about the adversary you're concerned about, or you can map your own capability. Now, once you've gone through all of this, you've got this nice sort of stacks, and you'll notice in this case, we don't have a bunch of research. partially because research is so resource intensive and not every team has people that are focused on research. Most of the time it is focused on what are the products we use and also what are things that we can supplement, whether it's integration, stuff like that to sort of speed those up. And that's where we get to attack chains. So this is where you can start to build things together to identify what are those specific tactics, and which ones do we rely on specific people for. This is something I always remind everybody with adversaries too. Adversaries have deadlines. That was another thing. Lots of leaks out of the Conti ransomware camp. They had some of their emails and chats and all of those things got spilled, and this was over their support of Russia for the war in Ukraine. And so somebody spilled all of those things. They went through, they have everything from reviews with managers. They have some of the same problems I'm sure you all are going through at organizations where someone new got hired and they're making more than the previous people, and birthdays, all of that stuff. And so that's something you have to remember. They have expertise too. They have to chart this stuff out too. And so they don't have, it's not just a blob of expertise that somehow just can go after anything. They have to choose both the targets based on the expertise they have, as well as try and map and build new capabilities. So that's why it's really important to be able to map all of these things, is that you can understand where they're going to shift. Now, not all TTPs are equal, right? And this is something where I give the example of if I'm going to start you and say you're starting externally from an engagement and you have to do discovery, and that's where you're starting, versus you have a persistent agent in a network. What are you going to choose if your objective is to get in the network? You're going to choose persistence every time. But that's because it's harder, right? And this is why you can identify those resource-heavy points. And especially if you have specific things in research, that is super resource-heavy. It is going to require experts and expertise. And that's why when you're looking at this, you want to shift things to the right. And so that's really what we're looking at, is shifting all of these things as much as we can to the right. Now, every TTP is not going to be able to be shifted. And your team might not have the budget, for instance, to buy a tool or a product that puts your capability in most of the product. But adversaries can't either. TTPs and just general adversary operations, they do have a lot of difficulties. For instance, users. Users always do different things, and while we most of the time talk about how users make things difficult for defenders, which they tend to do, it also means that attackers have to discover what's happening in an environment before they can do things like lateral movement. Unless they have an exploit, they tend to leverage whatever is in the environment, which requires waiting and learning about where they've landed. And so this is where you really want to see where are single points of failure too. This is another thing. If you have a team full of people and you rely on one person to get you initial access or to do defense evasion each time, what happens if they leave, right? We're in the middle or towards the end, or I don't know how they're charting it, of the Great Resignation, right? I've talked to many security companies that are all like, hey, if you know anyone good, send them my way. And so this is something that's increasingly something that more and more organizations are looking at, is how do we bake expertise as we get it, even for a short time, into either a specific tool or something that can be transitioned to someone new. Now, let's talk about how we can potentially shift right. One is automating technique changes. So this is something that MITRE ATT&CK is updated. They do a big update twice a year. Adversaries are really active. They actually, you have all these new cyber threat intel reports that come out on a pretty regular basis. Sometimes it's monthly, sometimes it's more than that. And then you have big vulnerabilities that pop up and everybody publishes something on it. And so if you're following some of this stuff, you need to make sure that if any 0-day pops up, you can deal with it, but you still have to deal with everything else too. And that's where automation comes in. Now, one of the challenges with automation is that this top one is, I think, one of the biggest challenges in this space, is that we tend to really focus on the research and custom parts of what we're building. Researchers want to come up with the research, identify something that they're doing, build a proof of concept to showcase that it is an idea that works, and then that's where we leave it. But the challenge is that that is still something that's important and needs to be brought into a product eventually. For a lot of those, it's vulnerabilities, for instance, that are still there, that are still going to be deployed in systems. I mean, legacy systems, there was a talk earlier that sort of talked about all of the legacy devices that are still across networks. And so this is why making sure you're able to identify old things through automation and scale is really important. Not all techniques are scalable. This is something else that is good in some terms and is bad in the others. It's good in that if every technique was scalable, it means adversaries could create worms or easier and faster, which that luckily has not necessarily been the case. But it also means that it requires more expertise or people to work through and make sure that something is tested in your environment on a more reoccurring basis. And then this last one here is something that a lot of businesses struggle with, is that not all techniques are relevant. Especially when it comes to MITRE ATT&CK and people are hearing about it more and more and more, they think we need to check every box. We need to make sure that we have 100% MITRE ATT&CK coverage. That is not how MITRE ATT&CK is supposed to be used. From the attack team themselves, they will tell you that. It is not a checkbox exercise. And so that's something that that is hard to sort of instill in leadership when you're showing graphics and they're like, why do we have all these boxes that aren't covered? And saying it doesn't matter to us is not something they always understand. So those are challenges here with automation, is that trying to figure out what do we want to automate and what is going to, and we have to prioritize. Now let's give an example of why automation is important when it comes to adapting to adversaries who also can make a shift. So let's start with PowerShell. PowerShell is something that continues to be a problem. Let's see, over a decade, I don't even remember when it was first introduced, but as far as security talks addressing PowerShell, Dave Kennedy gave one, I think back in 2012, 2013, that talked about, holy moly, like PowerShell is a huge attack surface, and if you're a pen tester, like you can just run away with it. Now, there's been better detections and things like that that have come around PowerShell, but there have been other research techniques that have been built into products that people aren't as aware of, and that's unmanaged PowerShell. It's PowerShell without executing PowerShell.exe. You call the DLL directly, and this is something that requires a different set of detections. And so this is really key, is an adversary can switch from PowerShell to unmanaged PowerShell, and previous detections could be useless. So you need a way to do that. Now, the question might be, how difficult would that be for adversaries? The top here is a little screenshot and a snippet from that Conti playbook. They have this PowerShell invoke nightmare, which is print nightmare, and then they have basically adding a new user. And this second one is a quick cheat sheet from Cobalt Strike that shows exactly how hard it would be for the adversaries that are building this to make this switch in their playbooks. It would be literally switching out the word PowerShell to PowerPick. Remember I said earlier, they're copy and pasting everything. They're not gonna think about it, they will copy and paste it. And this is something that's very easy for adversaries to change. It should also be very easy for you to change in your environment, because this is something that's potentially coming at literally any time. I don't actually know why adversaries haven't picked up on this yet, but sort of thankful that they haven't, because when it happens, they will have, unfortunately, more success, unless more and more people are testing against these. So this is where you really need some sort of tool that can do this. If you haven't worked with some of the red teaming tools before, there is something called the C2 Matrix. This is an open source community-led project. And it basically has all of these C2 platforms, and for a while there, every week a new red teamer was releasing a new command and control framework on Twitter. And so they took all of those and they've charted out the capabilities so that you can see what you need to test. It has open source solutions on there as well as paid ones, so you can do comparisons. So it also, if you don't want to look at the Google Sheet, it does have like a questionnaire where you can ask about the different types of features that you want to test, and it'll tell you which ones you can use. Now, adversary emulation is another way that we can tackle some of the challenges. Let's talk about some challenges with that, though, is that it is still a very expert-driven space. And so that's really the biggest issue with it. Some of the breach and attack simulation vendors are trying to address some of it, but largely right now, the pairing of cyber threat intelligence with red teamers that can essentially execute it, either in a defanged or benign way, is something that is still, again, very expert driven. And so that's something that is an issue here. Now, it can also solve some really hard problems for us. So let's talk about an adversary's capability shift. Initial access shifts from custom to product. What's the way that they would do this? How do you buy initial access? Well, you can buy a 0-day. Now, this is something that previously sort of the economics of ransomware sort of changed the equation around it. 0 days were expensive, and they have continued to get more expensive. But for instance, the Conti ransomware group made $2 billion, I think, last year. So that's a lot of money, and they can probably buy a lot of researchers and they can turn that money and a 0-day into money really easily and really quickly, right? And that's another thing with like the F5 exploit that came out. Most of the time, if something hits really quickly, most adversaries, especially when we're talking about ransomware, they do the same thing. They're doing everything else the same. They're just shifting how they do initial access. Now, if you're not familiar with Zerodium, they're an exploit vendor company. And if you can't see all of these, for instance, a Windows remote code execution with 0 clicks, so no user interaction. If you have one of those to sell to them, you'll make a cool mill, just like that. So my question is this in your budget, right? If you want to do a 0-day to make sure that you're keeping pace with adversaries, then this is what it potentially is going to cost you. And remember, this is if you're a researcher that has one, not if you're trying to buy it, which I'm guessing has a slight markup. So this is something just to keep in mind, and I still have to have conversations with people when they say we want 0-day exploit testing, and I pull up this chart and ask them if they want to add that to the quote. So that's something that there's an easier way. And if we want to do this from sort of the blue team perspective, it's assume breach testing. Assume the adversary gets in, all right? What would they do next? And so this covers a lot of different scenarios, even beyond the 0-day. We have insider threats. We have whether someone clicks an email. That's something I always, with all the security training that we have these days, there are still spear phishing emails that will land every single time. There are people in your organizations that are paid to open emails. And that's something, I'll give my example here. If the head of HR gets a Proton Mail email from someone that it contains an attachment and says this is an accusation of sexual harassment of a VP or the CEO of the company, and you need to enable macros to see it, they're gonna click it every time, because they should. It is their job, right? To make sure that they're checking that the company would be covered, and that's potentially a plausible scenario. So they're gonna click on that, and they will do it probably every time. There's other scenarios too, so you need to assume that's going to happen. And adversaries don't get very creative after that. They use the same things over and over and over again. So that's where assume breach testing allows you, while it's a little bit of an abstraction, it allows you to tackle a lot of those scenarios all at once. Same with insider threats. Now, moving up a little bit into something a bit more granular. This is a technique, specific technique ID, and in this case, it's actually a sub-technique, which attack couldn't just keep it to TTP. They had to make it a little bit more complicated, and so that's why they added sub-techniques about 2 years ago. And so under credential access, we have this OS credential dumping, LSAS memory. The tool that made this popular is Mimikatz. So you're gonna have to do this with all of your specific tactics that we've mapped out here. And so this is what it might look like. Now, even assume breach scenario, user execution is a general technique that they have that includes a lot of those things that I mentioned. It's got somebody clicks a link, somebody goes to our URL, somebody opens an email. And then we're gonna talk about process discovery a little bit more in depth, and then we just have all of these. Now notice we can't execute anything yet, but we're at least well on our way to understanding how we can test against this adversary and what parts of this that we can automate. And then this is the final one, which is the procedures. And so techniques and procedures really go hand in hand. They, of course, have layers of abstraction because you can have multiple procedures that map to a single technique. And this is that next step in understanding, can I automate this procedure, or is there a different one that I can? So, and this is the case where you can use proc dump to dump LSAS, and that's just some syntax there that you can run this command and you will get an LSAS dump. Now, a lot of questions come when you're operationalizing an attack or trying to figure out what are those procedures? Like, how do I make that map? If you go into MITRE ATT&CK, you'll get mixed reviews. Procedures are listed for a lot of things, but sometimes it talks about this adversary uses a specific piece of malware, and that's all it'll say. And so now you have to go and figure out, like maybe you don't have reverse engineering, or you have to go and figure out somebody that says this piece of malware does something this way. Because you remember, human operators are still driving that malware, right? And so a tool that was meant to sort of address this problem was Red Canary's Atomic Red Team project. It's a great project. It's sort of how people get started when they're looking at MITRE ATT&CK and they want to execute it within their environment. Now, a quick disclaimer about it. It's a great place to start, but it is not complete. It is a community-driven project, and it is really, really good. If you're interested in getting started with it, they've got a really, like I said, really welcoming community. You can easily contribute. It's something I always recommend people go and check out and see some of what the community has built out around it. But it has sort of become a checkbox exercise. As I mentioned before, MITRE ATT&CK has become something that everyone wants that checkbox at the technique level. But we still have to go with procedures, and testing of individual techniques is great for checking your logs, but adversaries never execute a single technique, not in a vacuum. They tend to execute them as a chain. And so this is where atomic red team tests come from. Unit testing or atomic unit testing in software engineering that was meant to test a very specific thing. And so that's where it comes from. It's really good for teching or getting started, but once you're trying to automate or emulate adversaries, it sort of falls short. Let's see, the last thing here is that the sort of secret with attack is I've shown you a really clear example of going through a tactic, a technique, and a procedure, but almost every single procedure requires 2 attack techniques in order to work. And so that's not always clear. So let's talk about process discovery. One of our, this was in the discovery tactic. Process discovery is the technique. Running task lists on command line is one way of doing it. Here's the thing, command line is its own technique. This is where I said before, you typically have a goal that you want to achieve, and then you have an execution method to achieve it. But those are 2 different MITRE ATT&CK techniques. Now there's other ways though to achieve this too, and we're talking about adaptive adversaries. They want to achieve the same goal oftentimes. They want to understand what are the processes that are running. They're not going to invent new ways to do it, but they might look for ways that might not be either logged or alerted on. And so that's where there's a bunch of different ways to do this. We have Windows command line, we have PowerShell, we have WMIC or WMI, is all different ways. All 3 of these commands give you the same info in different ways. Now there are atomic red team tests for all 3 of these, and that's great because you can either use the command line or PowerShell in order to execute them. However, there's another way that is the Windows API. Now API calls are something that are not well detected on right now. Most EDRs actually fail to detect these types of things. That's got some history behind it. Some of it is because if you're intercepting API calls, you can see basically everything that's going on within the system. It's hard to say, you're basically saying I need to monitor literally everything happening on the system for the greater good of security. And so that was a privacy concern when people were first looking at it with EDRs, and they said, no, we don't want that level of introspection, we don't need it. But more and more adversaries can do this. Every single one of these is listed as a MITRE ATT&CK procedure, which means that real adversaries have used these exact commands, in this case, this exact function in real compromises. And the reason that the native API doesn't work with Atomic Red Team is because it requires more than just running this. It's a function. You have to write a program that's going to call it directly. And so that's not something that's necessarily easy to do, but it is something that you still need to be able to test against. So that's some of the challenge with Atomic Red Team, is that you're not necessarily going to have something for each of those tests. You're going to have to figure out, all right, what are these different processes that we can use? In the case of this one, persistence, it's a long scheduled task creation. And so that's the granular level you have here is what you can use to figure out whether you can swap things out. deliberately in order to emulate specific adversaries. And so that's where, as you build this out, you're potentially going to use other tools and other cyber threat intelligence in order to figure out these. If you don't want to do it yourself, there are some resources that we have here. MITRE has MITRE Ingenuity. They have their Center for Threat Informed Defense is what they call it. And so they have blogs, they have a GitHub that has all of their emulation plans. And they also have the attack evaluations, which actually walks through all of the different EDR vendors. They have it's like 20 or 30 of them at this point that they run through these tests, and they do these comparisons so that you can see what are the specific techniques, what are the procedures that these EDRs are able to detect or are not able to detect. Now, Scythe, we also have something called Threat Thursdays. We release these once a month, and the idea is that they are open to everyone in the community. MITRE has much more detailed plans. I got to give them credit. It's the gold standard for it, but it takes them 8 to 12 months to release these things because they do a ton of work with them. So I'd recommend checking those out. Same thing with cyber threat intelligence reporting. The DFIR report is another one I like to give a shout out to. They cover a lot of ransomware engagements, and they really go down to the procedure level. And so that's something when you are looking at cyber threat intel that allows you to build out this type of, this sort of level of test that you're going to need, because otherwise you're going to be filling in the stories with holes yourself. So just wrapping up here, I think the key thing that I really want to get across beyond just giving you some of the ways to think about things as well as some techniques to do that is that automating techniques and capabilities is just as important as researching new techniques. This is something that I think in information security, it's really easy to get swept up in all the cool new CVEs people come out with. But there is a lot of really good research that's done that needs to be built into a tool, built into a product, and that will overall be something that helps the greater community. And so that's something that I just want to highlight and sort of call out to everyone that's doing that. Thank you, because I don't think people get enough credit. All right, so wrapping it up here for since I'm the last talk, I've got a couple, if people have questions, happy to stick around. Otherwise, you can catch me afterward or around.
Thank you very much.
Cool. Questions, comments, question?
This whole lecture seems to be telling me that we're talking about evolution on the red team side, that we're going from what we would call a pilot in an aircraft to just an operator sitting at a terminal, like the old teletype operators. Is that the true gist of what I'm getting here?
So the question was around, let's try to paraphrase that, is around, is this sort of a paradigm shift from having a specific expert that is driving everything versus someone that people that are doing things sort of, let's see, more remote, scaled out. And I think the answer for a lot of it is yes. I mean, I think from a red team perspective, that area has sort of shifted even over the past 3 to 5 years. Red teams used to do basically a lot of the things that I just talked about up here. But they are increasingly being asked to get around EDRs and those types of things. And so they have to dive deeper and deeper and deeper into understanding how those things work. And I think that's something that has required a level of expertise that continues to go up. And so not quite sure if I'm answering your question here on this, but I think we are seeing a shift in the types of expertise that is required of red teams, and it's also meaning that you have tools that are sort of backfilling what they used to do because there's such a need for testing across technology, right? Even 5-10 years ago, you had a lot of businesses weren't quite forced yet to use too much technology in their day-to-day, but I mean, we've seen ransomware actors hit hair salons as well as, of course, Fortune 50 companies. And so from that standpoint, you probably are not going to have a red team come and do a test for a hair salon, right? that they just aren't going to be able to afford necessarily that level of expert. And that, I think, is actually the majority of companies won't necessarily be able to afford a red team to come in and do something. So, all right, yeah. Other question?
Yeah, so I was just thinking about in the context of my company, small security team, and when we've set out the penetration tests, obviously they're not up to speed on our environment.
Yeah.
And I've also been thinking about the guy who hates security, the software developer, and just thinking how important is it for people internal to be able to test your own environment? To me, it seems like there's a lot of hate against security people, and so our software engineering team, actually today, I was reading about it, they're upset because we're going to be pulling back on their 30% sharpening time, whereas as a security person, we're spending a lot of time trying to secure, we're not really improving our skills. So would you think that it's valuable for security people to act as a red team member, to attack your own?
So the question was around whether you should have people internally that are attacking your own infrastructure, providing the red team. And my answer to that is yes. I would call it a purple team, though. And to address part of what you mentioned is that animosity sometimes between teams. Sometimes when it comes to red teaming and penetration testing, there's a win-lose mentality, and that's something that tends to drive tensions high, right? And so when it comes to purple teaming, it's sort of taking one of those specific things. So I'll jump back in my slides here. So let's take this page, for example. Anything that you can link to MITRE ATT&CK, you can say, this has been used by a real adversary. That's how they scope down attack, is that they want to make sure that only things that have been used by real adversaries, and that goes back to what I was saying about not every technique matters, and because if you're just following red team researchers on Twitter, like, they're brilliant people, but they're releasing new stuff like every couple hours, essentially. Where if you went to one of your teams, like your SOC, for instance, and you were like, we're going to test task lists, and then we're going to test this, and we're going to test this, and see, you could be transparent about it. Everybody wins regardless, and I think when it comes to talking and building relationships with other teams, right, that is something that takes a lot of time, and being able to try and make the rest of your processes more efficient to allow for that sort of human interaction, team building time is important. I think that's where, the short answer to your question is yes, you should do more things internally if you can, but as you mentioned, teams are stressed these days from so many different things they're asked to do. And so that's where if you have tools like some of the ones I mentioned from like the C2 matrix and other things like that, Caldera is another automation tool that is open source and free. Those are the things that you can do that hopefully help you free up time and provide you sort of a quicker way to address some of those things. But yeah, that's a tough problem, but I also think that's a super common problem right now across teams, and that's where red teams are, I think, being asked more and more to try and be more collaborative, to try and help build bridges within organizations because of some of those. So yeah, good. Yeah, another question.
Really just a statement. I'm skeptical that the companies that ask for red teams to bypass EDR actually use that information, learn from it.
So yeah, the comment was that skeptical that companies that hire red teams to bypass EDR leverage that, and I would agree. I think the understanding of what it takes, and also that's the type of thing, like, red teams are full of experts. That's a lot of people don't see sort of behind the curtain of all of the things it takes for red teams to do these days to be successful.
I would say the money would be better spent making sure EDR is running everything, because they probably got it like 95%. There's 5% where it's just IT forgot about it.
Yes, and to repeat the question for everyone is that making money's better spent with more collaborative efforts, like making sure EDR is running everywhere, that it's tuned, those types of things. And I think, yes, we're seeing more of an embrace of those types of approaches in organizations, and that because the organizations that really do benefit from a red team that have, that can bring in that expertise is a very small subset realistically. And so trying to make sure that there is sort of a broader, more collaborative nature around security can help address some of these problems that I know a lot of organizations, and I've been in several that have had teams that are butting heads constantly because of actually past incidents between teams. And so there's that sort of history within the organization that makes it really difficult to achieve anything. So yeah, good point. All right, I've got 3 things here. First question goes to you here. And then I have 2 more, backdoors and breaches. All right. Oh, all right. Who doesn't have one? There we go. All right, come on down. What's that? Ah, that's all right. You got to get your prize. Can't be shy for prize. One more? I'm gonna just throw it. All right, all right. You ready? All right, I'll underhand it. We'll see how this goes. Ooh. It's all right. It's all right. Luckily, I'm in cybersecurity, not athletics. Anything else? Cool. Thanks, everyone. Thanks again.